I will not take this abuse.
You're right, I'm sorry. Once I was a wooden boy, a little wooden.
Engine 23, rescue 23, Met 9 all on radio. Respond to the drowning.
This could not be true. How could this possibly be true?
When Matthew Perry died on October 28, 2023, the world lost more than just Chandler Bing.
The death of Friends star Matthew Perry.
Matthew Perry died last October.
Friends star Matthew Perry died as a result of, quote, acute effects of ketamine and subsequent drowning.
They lost a man who spent decades fighting demons most fans never saw. A cautionary tale about fame, addiction, and a healthcare system that sometimes protects the wrong people. His death wasn't just tragic, it was preventable. And the story of how he died reveals something deeply disturbing about the world celebrities inhabit when they're struggling. The rise to Chandler Bing. Before Friends made him a household name, Matthew Perry was just another struggling actor in Los Angeles. Born in 1969 to parents who divorced when he was young, Perry split his childhood between Montreal with his mother and Los Angeles with his father. He showed promise early, landing small roles throughout the 1980s and early 90s, but nothing stuck. He appeared in shows like Growing Pains and Beverly Hills 90210, always the guest star, never the lead. Then came 1994. Perry auditioned for a new NBC sitcom about 6 friends living in New York City. The role of Chandler Bing, the sarcastic commitment phobe with a knack for awkward humor, seemed written specifically for Perry's comedic timing. He got the part, and when Friends premiered that September, everything changed. The show became a cultural phenomenon almost overnight, and Perry's delivery of Chandler's one-liners made him a fan favorite. By the late 1990s, Matthew Perry was one of the most recognizable faces on television. Friends dominated ratings, the cast became genuine celebrities, and Perry's salary reflected his value. By the final seasons, he was earning $1 million per episode. He attended premieres, dated high-profile women, and seemed to embody the successful Hollywood actor. Viewers tuned in every Thursday night to watch Chandler's neurotic charm, his evolving relationship with Monica, and Perry's impeccable comedic timing. On screen, everything looked perfect. Behind the scenes, Perry was already drowning. Behind the laughter. What fans didn't know during Friends' 10-year run was that Matthew Perry was fighting a war with addiction that nearly killed him multiple times. His struggles with alcohol and prescription painkillers started in the late 1990s, around the show's 3rd season. Perry later admitted that he couldn't remember filming large portions of Friends, entire seasons lost to the fog of substance abuse. He showed up, said his lines, got his laughs, and went home to pills and vodka. The physical changes were visible to anyone paying attention. Perry's weight fluctuated dramatically throughout the series. In some seasons, he looked gaunt and hollow, in others noticeably heavier. These weren't just normal fluctuations, they were direct results of his addiction cycle. When he was deep into pills and alcohol, he'd lose weight rapidly. When he'd attempt to get clean, the weight would come back. Tabloids occasionally speculated, but the show's producers and his castmates largely kept his struggles private. In 2000, Perry's pancreas began failing due to alcohol abuse. He was hospitalized, and the severity of the situation briefly shocked him into seeking help. He entered rehab for the first time, though the public story was vague about the details. He returned to Friends, continued performing, and fans remained largely unaware of how close they'd come to losing Chandler Bing permanently. But the addiction didn't disappear just because Perry wanted it to. The pattern repeated itself throughout Friends' remaining years. Perry would get clean for a while, feel better, convince himself he had it under control, then relapse. The set became a place where everyone knew, but nobody quite knew what to do. His castmates cared about him, but addiction doesn't respond to care alone. Perry was functional enough to work, talented enough that the show couldn't afford to lose him, and sick enough that every day was a gamble. The laughter America heard every Thursday night was real, but it was coming from a man who was quietly falling apart. The spiral deepens. After Friends ended in 2004, the structure that had held Matthew Perry's life together disappeared. Without the routine of the show, without the daily accountability of showing up to set, his addiction accelerated. The 2000s became a decade of emergency rooms, rehab facilities, and near-death experiences that the public only learned about years later. In 2018, Perry revealed that his colon had ruptured due to opioid abuse when he was 49 years old. The rupture was so severe it nearly killed him. He spent 2 weeks in a coma and 5 months hospitalized. When he woke up, doctors told him he'd been given a 2% chance of survival. He'd been wearing a colostomy bag for months. This wasn't a Hollywood exaggeration, this was medical reality. The drugs had literally torn his insides apart. Perry's relationship with opioids had started, like many addictions do, with a legitimate prescription. A jet ski accident led to painkillers, and painkillers led to dependency. But by the 2000s, legitimate prescriptions weren't enough. He was taking 50 to 60 pills a day at his worst, an amount that should have killed him long before it finally ruptured his colon. His days revolved around getting more pills, taking pills, and figuring out how to function while taking pills. The rehab stints added up. Perry later estimated he'd spent over $7 million on attempts to get sober. He went to rehab 15 times. Some stays lasted weeks, others months. Some helped temporarily, others didn't help at all. The longest period of sobriety he managed was a few years in the mid-2010s, but even that eventually crumbled. Addiction doesn't follow a linear path, and Perry's path was particularly brutal. Every relapse felt like failure, every attempt at sobriety felt fragile, and the shame of being a public figure struggling with something so stigmatized only made everything harder. Attempts at recovery. There were genuine moments of hope in Matthew Perry's story. During his periods of sobriety, he didn't just focus on himself, he tried to help others fighting the same battles. In 2013, Perry received the Champion of Recovery Award from the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. He'd been vocal about addiction, trying to use his platform to reduce stigma and push for better treatment options. Perry also put his money where his mouth was. He converted his Malibu mansion into a sober living facility called Perry House, which operated from 2013 to 2015. The facility focused on helping men in recovery, providing structured support during the vulnerable period after initial treatment. Perry wasn't just lending his name to the cause. He was actively involved, understanding from personal experience how crucial that transitional period could be. In interviews during his sober periods, Perry was remarkably candid. He talked about hitting bottom, about the shame and isolation of addiction, about how difficult it was to ask for help when you're supposed to be a successful celebrity. He wanted to be remembered for helping people with addiction more than for playing Chandler Bing, a statement that revealed how deeply his struggles had shaped his identity. The work was real, the advocacy was genuine, and for periods of time, it seemed like maybe he'd figured it out. But addiction is patient, and it doesn't care about good intentions or past successes. The relapses kept coming, each one a reminder that recovery isn't a destination you reach and stay at forever. It's a daily choice, and some days are harder than others. The final years, the 2010s and early 2020s, were difficult years for Matthew Perry professionally. He tried to recapture the magic of Friends with new shows, but nothing connected. Mr. Sunshine was canceled after one season. Go On lasted a season. The Odd Couple reboot made it 2 seasons. Perry was still talented, still funny, but the television landscape had changed, and audiences weren't showing up for his new projects the way they once had. His personal life followed a similar pattern of near misses. Perry had several high-profile relationships over the years, but never married. He got engaged to Molly Hurwitz in 2020, but they broke up in 2021. Friends had given him fame and wealth, but the stability of a long-term relationship seemed to elude him. In interviews, he acknowledged his struggles with intimacy and commitment, traits that his character Chandler had turned into comedy, but that Perry experienced as genuine obstacles. In November 2022, Perry published his memoir, Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing. The book was brutally honest about his addiction, holding nothing back about the pills, the alcohol, the health emergencies, and the constant battle to stay alive. Reviews praised his candor, and the book became a bestseller. Perry did press tours, sat for interviews, and seemed to be in a relatively good place. He talked about being sober, about the lessons he'd learned, about wanting to help others avoid his mistakes. But writing about recovery and maintaining recovery are two different things. In the months leading up to his death, those close to Perry noticed changes. He seemed more isolated, spending more time alone at his Pacific Palisades home. He was still attending therapy, still engaging with his recovery work, but something had shifted. The specific details of his state of mind in October 2023 remain private, known only to those closest to him, but the outcome speaks for itself. October 28, 2023. It was a Saturday morning in Los Angeles when Matthew Perry died. He was 54 years old, living in his Pacific Palisades home, and according to initial reports, he'd been playing pickleball earlier that day. He returned home, and at some point that afternoon, he got into his hot tub. What happened next would become the subject of intense investigation and eventual criminal charges. Perry was found unresponsive in his jacuzzi. His assistant discovered him and called 911, but by the time emergency responders arrived, it was too late. The immediate cause of death wasn't obvious. There were no signs of trauma, no evidence of foul play in the traditional sense. The scene looked like a tragic accident, perhaps a drowning, maybe a heart attack. The reality was far more complicated. News of Perry's death broke quickly. Social media flooded with tributes from fans, co-stars, and fellow actors. His Friends castmates released a joint statement expressing their devastation. NBC aired a tribute. Fans gathered outside the Friends apartment building in New York to leave flowers and notes. The outpouring was genuine and massive. Matthew Perry had touched millions of lives through his work, and those millions were mourning together. But even as tributes poured in, questions lingered. Perry had been public about his sobriety journey. He'd seemed healthy in recent months. What had happened? The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner took custody of Perry's body for autopsy, and the world waited for answers. Initial reports were cautious, noting only that Perry had drowned, but that the investigation was ongoing. The word drowning seemed insufficient, incomplete. People don't usually just drown in their own hot tub for no reason. As days turned into weeks, speculation grew. Was it a heart attack? A stroke? Had he relapsed? The silence from official sources was frustrating but necessary. Toxicology tests take time, especially when the results might be complex, and in Matthew Perry's case, the toxicology results would prove to be both shocking and infuriating. The investigation unfolds. In December 2023, the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner released their findings. Matthew Perry's cause of death was listed as the acute effects of ketamine. The levels found in his blood were in the range used for general anesthesia during surgery, extremely high for someone not in a medical setting. The drowning had occurred because the ketamine had essentially incapacitated him while he was in the water. It wasn't an accident in the way most people understood accidents. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic, legal when used in controlled medical settings, and increasingly used for treatment-resistant depression. Perry had been undergoing ketamine infusion therapy for depression and anxiety, a legitimate and increasingly common treatment. But the ketamine found in his system couldn't have come from his legal therapy sessions. The half-life of ketamine is too short. His last known infusion therapy had been over a week before his death. Someone had given him ketamine much more recently, and that someone had given him a dangerous amount. The Los Angeles Police Department and the Drug Enforcement Administration launched a criminal investigation. They examined Perry's phone records, financial transactions, and communications. What they uncovered was disturbing. Perry had been obtaining ketamine illegally from multiple sources, including doctors who were willing to supply him outside of legitimate medical oversight. In August 2024, federal prosecutors announced charges against 5 individuals in connection with Perry's death. The defendants included Perry's personal assistant, 2 doctors, and 2 dealers who had been supplying him with ketamine. According to the indictment, these individuals had been exploiting Perry's addiction, charging him thousands of dollars for vials of ketamine that cost them a fraction of that amount. Text messages between the doctors showed them discussing how much they could charge Perry, with one message reading, "I wonder how much this moron will pay." The details were heartbreaking. Perry's assistant had been injecting him with ketamine multiple times a day in the weeks before his death. The doctors had taught the assistant how to inject it, provided the supplies, and continued supplying the drug even as Perry's use escalated to dangerous levels. On the day Perry died, his assistant had injected him with multiple doses. The final injection occurred while Perry was alone, and shortly after, he got into the hot tub. The ketamine took effect, he lost consciousness, and he drowned. A system that failed him. Matthew Perry's death wasn't just about individual bad actors supplying him with drugs. It exposed something larger about how addiction, celebrity, and the medical system intersect in ways that can be fatal. Perry had access to the best addiction treatment money could buy, yet he still died from substances provided by medical professionals who should have been helping him, not enabling him. The doctors involved in Perry's case weren't street dealers. They were licensed physicians who understood exactly what they were doing. They knew Perry was an addict, knew the dangers of providing him with ketamine in uncontrolled settings, and did it anyway because he was willing to pay. This is the dark side of concierge medicine, where wealthy clients can sometimes find doctors willing to blur ethical lines for the right price. Perry's wealth, instead of protecting him, made him a target. There's also the broader question of how ketamine is being used and regulated. Ketamine therapy for depression is promising, but it exists in a regulatory gray area. Some clinics are careful and ethical. Others are more concerned with profit than patient safety. Perry's legitimate ketamine therapy may have inadvertently exposed him to the drug that eventually killed him, creating a pathway from legal medical treatment to illegal supply. Celebrity addiction adds another layer of complication. Famous people struggling with substance abuse often face unique challenges, privacy concerns that limit their treatment options, enablers who benefit from their addiction, and the financial means to obtain drugs in ways that bypass normal street-level supply chains. Perry had talked about feeling isolated in his addiction, about how fame made it harder to get help in some ways, even as it theoretically made resources more available. Matthew Perry's story is one of talent, addiction, moments of hope, and ultimate tragedy. He made millions laugh for 10 years on Friends, then spent the next 20 years fighting battles. Most of those fans never fully understood. His death at 54 wasn't the peaceful end of a life well lived. It was the predictable outcome of a system that failed to protect a vulnerable person from those willing to exploit him. The 5 people charged in connection with his death face serious prison time, but prosecuting them doesn't change the larger problems. Somewhere right now, another addict with money is finding a doctor willing to supply them with dangerous substances. Another assistant is helping someone use drugs because that's what they're being paid to do. Another family is about to get a phone call that will shatter their world. Perry's death was preventable, and that's perhaps the most tragic part of all. He didn't have to die in that hot tub at 54, but the combination of his addiction, other people's greed, and systemic failures made it almost inevitable. The world lost Chandler Bing, but more importantly, it lost Matthew Perry, and the circumstances of his death should make everyone angry about how we treat addiction, celebrity, and medical ethics in America.